Grandpa, why does your name still appear on the property record of the house Dad sold 14 years ago? When Raymond Hale's son, Derek, handed him $100 bill and walked away from the family home, Raymond told himself he understood. People make choices. Families fall apart. He packed what fit in 2 bags and did not look back. For 14 years, he believed his son had chosen his mother over him, chosen money, chosen comfort, chosen the easier story. Then a 17-year-old boy doing a school genealogy project typed a name into a search bar, and everything Raymond thought he knew about that day began to unravel. The truth was not that his son had betrayed him. The truth was worse and more complicated and stranger than that. And it had been sitting in a county records database the entire time, waiting for someone to look. My name is Raymond Hale. I am 61 years old, and for most of my working life I was a licensed real estate appraiser and title examiner for Franklin County. Ohio, the kind of work where you learn to read a chain of ownership the way other people read a face, looking for the gaps, the corrections, the moments where the paperwork doesn't quite line up with what someone's telling you. I retired early, partly because my knees gave out, and partly because I was tired of being the person who found the thing no one wanted to find. I live alone now in a 2-bedroom apartment in Westerville. I keep the 2nd bedroom empty. I am not sure why. My name is Raymond Hale, and I am going to tell you about the phone call that changed the only story I had left. The phone rang on a Tuesday evening in March, during the kind of early spring that couldn't decide if it was still winter. I was at the kitchen table, sorting through a cardboard box I had not opened in 11 years. The box had moved with me 3 times from the house on Dunmore Street, to the apartment on 5th, to this one, and every time I carried it, I told myself I would go through it that weekend. I never did. That night, for no reason I could name, I cut the tape. Inside, an envelope from the Franklin County Recorder's Office, dated 15 years back. A birthday card from Derek's 6th birthday construction paper, his name written in crayon. A photograph of the 3 of us standing in front of the Dunmore Street house the summer we bought it. Carol holding a key. Derek on my shoulders. Me squinting into the sun. I had the photograph in my hand when the phone rang. Unknown number. Columbus area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. The voice on the other end was young teenage. Unsteady in the way of someone who has rehearsed something and is now discovering that rehearsing and doing are different things. Is this Raymond Hale, the property appraiser? Former appraiser, I said. Who's this? A pause. Then, my name is Daniel. Daniel Hale. Another pause. Longer. I think you're my grandfather. I set the photograph face down on the table. I did not do it on purpose. My hand just put it down. Daniel, I said. Yes, sir. How old are you? 17. I'll be 18 in June. He said it the way teenagers say a guess as if the approaching birthday already counts. I'm doing this project for school. Family history. My teacher wants us to trace ownership of property going back 3 generations, and I was looking at records for the house on Dunmore Street, and your name came up, and I didn't understand why, because Dad, he said you signed everything over. And he stopped. I'm sorry. I don't know how to say this. Take your time, I said. He took a breath. I heard it clear, the kind of deliberate breath you take when you're trying not to sound as nervous as you are. Grandpa, why does your name still appear on the property record of the house Dad sold 14 years ago? I did not answer immediately. Not because I didn't know the answer, I did. Or I thought I did, but because the question landed somewhere I hadn't expected it to land. In 14 years, no one had asked me that. In 14 years, I had not allowed myself to think too carefully about why I had never removed the lien. The lien A mechanic's lien I had filed against the property in the final months of my marriage, when I was still paying for a contractor who had rebuilt the back porch. It was a minor thing. Legally, a few $1,000s, fully resolved between me and the contractor, but I had never formally released it from the county record. At the time, I told myself it was an oversight. Later, I told myself I'd never gotten around to it. Neither answer satisfied me. And tonight, with a 17-year-old boy breathing carefully on the other end of the phone, I began to understand that both answers were probably lies I had told myself for convenience. "Where did you find this?" I asked. "The Franklin County Auditor's website," he said. "They have a public property search. You can see all the recorded instruments. Your name is listed as a line holder on the parcel. There's a release date field, and it's blank." Of course it was blank. "Daniel," I said slowly, "what exactly did your father tell you about me?" Another pause. This one was different, heavier, like he was measuring something. "He said you and Grandma had a bad divorce. He said you gave up the house because you didn't want to fight about it anymore. He said you signed everything over, and then you moved away." I looked at the photograph lying face down on the table. "When did he tell you that?" "When I was little. 9 or 10, maybe." I asked where my other grandpa was, and he said it was complicated. My mom told me not to push him about it. 9 or 10, which meant Derek had already made his peace with the story by then, had built it into something he could hand to a child. Simple and clean. The kind of explanation that closes a door rather than opening one. "Does your father know you called me?" I asked. "No, sir. I'd like you to keep it that way for now," I said. "Not forever. Just for a little while. Can you do that?" He said he could. I believed him. There was something in his voice that reminded me of myself at that age. That particular teenage seriousness that adults underestimate. We talked for another 20 minutes. I asked about school. He was a junior, good at math, thinking about engineering. He had Carol's coloring from the one photograph I'd seen of Derek's family on a neighborhood Facebook page I had looked at exactly once, 4 years ago, and then made myself stop. Daniel had my son's build, tall, narrow-shouldered. He said he had a little sister named Mia, who was 14. I had a granddaughter I had never met. I kept my voice level. It is a professional habit, and also a personal one. I spent too many years delivering bad news about property values to learn to let my face show what I was feeling. But after we hung up, I sat at that kitchen table for a long time without moving. The cardboard box open in front of me, and the photograph still face down, and the Franklin County Recorder's envelope sitting where I'd left it. I picked up the envelope. Inside was a document I had forgotten I'd kept, a recorded copy of the lien filing, stamped and certified, dated the February before the divorce was final. My signature at the bottom block letters, the way I always signed documents, with the little hook on the capital R that I'd had since high school. I looked at it for a while. Then I called my attorney. She didn't pick up. It was almost 9 at night, so I left a message saying I needed to pull some records on a property transaction from 14 years back. And could she help me get access to the full chain of title on Dunmore Street? I kept my voice calm. I am good at that. What I did not say in the message, what I did not allow myself to say even in the privacy of my own kitchen, was the thing that had been sitting in the back of my mind since Daniel asked his question. If my name was still on that record, if the lien had never been released, then the sale of that house, the sale Derek had carried out while I stood in the driveway with $100 in an envelope, had gone through with an unresolved encumbrance on the title, which meant someone had signed a release on my behalf. And I had not signed anything. I opened the cardboard box wider and found what I was looking for near the bottom, a manila folder labeled Dunmore Reclosing Docs, in my own handwriting. I had packed it without looking at it the day I left the house. I had carried it through 3 apartments without opening it, Now I spread the contents across the kitchen table and began to read. The folder held my copies of the original mortgage documents, the deed, the title insurance policy, and buried near the back a letter from a company called Meridian Bridge Properties, L.C., dated 6 weeks before the closing. The letter was addressed to Carol, not to me, not to both of us, to Carol. It was a purchase offer made directly to my wife, for a house that was legally in both our names. I turned the letter over. No Chi-Chi line, no indication it had been sent to me at all. I sat with that for a moment. Then I picked up my pen. I still use a pen for notes, a habit from 20 years of annotating appraisal. Reportsand wrote 3 things on the back of the envelope from the recorder's office. First, who is Meridian Bridge Properties? L.C. Second, who signed the lien release if I didn't? Third, why a purchase offer went to Carol alone. I capped the pen and looked at the 3 questions for a long time. Outside, it had started to rain. March rain in Columbus is a specific kind of cold. It gets into the window frames, and you can hear it in the walls. I'd lived in that Dunmore Street house for 11 years before everything fell apart, and I remembered that sound rain in the walls on early spring nights. I had not let myself think about that house in a long time. I thought about it now. I thought about the boy on the phone with his father's build and his grandmother's eyes, sitting somewhere in Columbus with a school project and a question no one had thought to ask for 14 years. I did not sleep well that night, but before I went to bed, I pulled out my laptop and typed Meridian Bridge Properties, LLC, into the Ohio Secretary of State's business search. The registered agent was a man named Gary Pollock. Gary Pollock was Carol's older brother. Here is what I knew about Gary Pollock, and here is what I had chosen not to think about for 14 years. Gary was 4 years older than Carol, and he was the kind of man who treated every family gathering like a negotiation he intended to win. He sold commercial real estate. He had. The last time I'd had occasion to know anything about his life, and he had opinions about my work that he delivered as compliments. Raymond does the boring end of the business, he used to say at Christmas dinners, smiling, refilling his wine. He finds out what things are worth. I find out what they could be worth. He laughed at his own joke every time. Carol always laughed too. A half second after he did. I hadn't liked Gary. I had tolerated Gary because he was Carol's brother and because the alternative was conflict. And for most of my marriage, I had made the decision that conflict cost more than it was worth. That decision, as it turned out, had been expensive in a different way. I spent the first week after Daniel's call doing what I had trained myself to do in difficult situations, nothing visible. I went to work. I do part-time consultation work for a title company downtown, 3 days a week. Enough to keep me useful, without killing me, and I was careful and quiet, and I did not tell anyone what I had found in the cardboard box. But every evening I came home and I worked, slowly and methodically, the way I had worked through every complicated title chain in my career. I requested the full recorded instrument history on the Dunmore Street parcel from the county. It took 3 business days and cost me $40 at the recorder's office window. The clerk, a young woman who had worked there about a year, not long enough to remember me from my county days, handed me a stack of printed pages without looking up from her computer. I took them to a diner 2 blocks away and ordered coffee and read through them twice before touching the coffee. The chain was this: Raymond Hale and Carol Hale, jointenant, acquired the property in 1993. Mortgage, recorded. Lender Citizens Federal. Various subordinate instruments over the years, the lien I'd filed in 2008. A second mortgage taken out in 2006 that I had not known about, and a release of that second mortgage in 2009. I stopped at the second mortgage. $200,000, borrowed against the equity in my house in 2006, recorded in the county records. I had not known about it. I searched my memory carefully. 2006. I was traveling frequently for appraisal work, sometimes gone 2 weeks out of 4. Carol handled the household finances we had agreed on that years earlier. After a tax season argument that neither of us wanted to repeat, she paid the bills. I deposited the paychecks, and I had not looked closely at account statements the way I should have. I was trusting. That is the word I use now. What I probably was, if I am being accurate. I was incurious. I believed the structure of my life was sound, and I did not check it the way I would have checked anyone else's documents. $200,000, borrowed and repaid, all without my knowledge, except I would have had to sign for it. You cannot encumber a jointly held property without both owners' signatures. I had never signed for it. I set down my coffee cup very carefully and looked at the recorded instrument number on the second mortgage. Then I looked at the release instrument number, 3 years later. Then I looked at the lien release me lien, the one I had filed and never released, recorded 3 months before the closing date on the sale to Meridian Bridge Properties. 3 signatures, on 3 documents, none of which I had signed. The coffee had gone cold without me noticing. The diner was starting to fill up for the lunch rush. I folded the papers and put them in my jacket pocket and put a $10 bill on the table and left. I called Margaret Osei from the parking lot. Margaret had been a real estate attorney for 30 years, and she had worked with me on 6 complicated title disputes over the course of my career. We were not close friends. We were professional colleagues who respected each other, but she was the person I trusted to look at a chain of title and tell me what she actually saw, not what I wanted to hear. I need you to look at something, I told her, off the clock. For now, I'm not sure yet what we're dealing with. Raymond. Off the clock usually means the something is either very simple or very serious. I think it's serious, I said. I think someone recorded forged instruments in the county and used them to close a property sale 14 years ago. A pause. Margaret has a very specific pause she uses when she is deciding how to say something that she already knows the answer to. Whose property? She asked. Mine. Another pause. Come to my office Thursday morning, she said. Bring everything you have. I went back to my car and sat in it for a few minutes. It was a grey Tuesday, the kind of weather that makes Columbus look like a city that was never sure it wanted to exist. I had driven past Dunmore Street twice since moving out, once by accident. Once on purpose, and both times I had been struck by how ordinary it looked. A beige colonial on a quiet street, the kind of house that meant something specific when you lived in it and meant nothing at all from the outside. Derek had been 22 when the divorce was finalized. He'd been living with Carol during the proceedings, which I had understood at the time as the choice of a young man who needed stability and had gone where stability seemed to be. I had not blamed him for it, or I had tried not to. The day he came to my temporary apartment, I was renting a room from a colleague while I figured out my next move. He sat across from me at a folding table, and he looked like someone who had been handed a script and was unhappy about it and had decided to deliver it anyway. Dad, he said, Mom and I talked about the house. Okay, I said. She thinks it makes more sense for her to handle the sale, you know, given everything. He paused. She said you already talked about this, that you agreed. I had not agreed to anything. Carol and I had argued about the house through 3 months of divorce proceedings. We had never resolved it. The last time I had spoken to Carol directly about the property was through our attorneys. I didn't agree to that, I said. Derek looked at the table. She said you did, he said quietly. She said you signed something. Derek. I waited until he looked up. I didn't sign anything. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he looked away. I saw something move through his face, something that was not quite disbelief and not quite acceptance. Something uncomfortable in the space between them. He reached into his jacket pocket and put an envelope on the table. "She said to give you this," he said. Inside the envelope was $500 in cash and a handwritten note that said, "Raymond, for your trouble. Take care of yourself." It was not signed. That was not $100. That was $500. 14 years of memory had apparently simplified the amount, but the insult was the same. I did not touch the money for 3 days. Then I deposited it and tried to forget about it. I did not forget about it. What I had not understood then, sitting at that folding table watching my son fail to meet my eyes, was what I understood now. Derek had been told a story. He had been given a version of events that explained my behavior, that made my absence make sense, that gave him a reason to grieve me without having to be angry at his mother. "She said you signed something." I heard that differently now than I had 14 years ago. It wasn't guilt, coming from Derek. It was confusion. He had believed what he'd been told, and what he'd been told, I was becoming increasingly certain, was a version of events that his mother had constructed carefully, out of forged paper and selective silence, to protect herself. Daniel had a father who had spent 14 years believing a lie, and that father had spent 14 years passing that lie on, second-hand, to a son he had. I drove home and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the photograph again, the one of the three of us in front of the house, Derek on my shoulders, squinting because the sun was behind me and he was looking into my face. I was the shade he was looking for. I set the photograph upright this time. The week before I met with Margaret, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went through every joint tax return Carol and I had filed, looking for the second mortgage. In 2006, we had reported mortgage interest from 2 sources. I had assumed at the time that this was a billing change from Citizens Federal. I had not looked closely. I had signed the return. The second lender was called Horizon Capital Partners, a name that meant nothing to me then and meant something specific now, because when I searched it in the Secretary of State's database, the registered agent was the same law firm that had handled Gary Pollock's commercial transactions. The money borrowed against my house in 2006 had gone through a lender connected to Carol's brother and had been repaid by the time Meridian Bridge Gary's company purchased the house in 2010. I drew the shape of it on a legal pad that Thursday morning before I drove to Margaret's office. A triangle. Money borrowed from Gary's network. Against my house. Using my forged signature. Money repaid presumably from the sale proceeds, with Carol taking whatever remained through Gary's purchasing company, at a price that was below market. The house sold for $260,000 in 2010. I pulled the comparable sales data from that period. I still have access to the MLS records through my consultancy work, and the average sale price on Dunmore Street in that quarter was $312,000, a $52,000 discount, paid to a company owned by Carol's brother, financed in part by borrowed equity from the same property. Margaret looked at the legal pad for a long time when I showed it to her. "Raymond," she said finally, "do you know how long the statute of limitations is on mortgage fraud in Ohio?" I looked it up. I said, "Federal mortgage fraud has no statute of limitations if it involves financial institutions. Civil fraud in Ohio is 4 years from discovery." Margaret nodded. "Discovery," she said, "meaning when you found out, not when it happened." "Meaning last Tuesday," I said, "when my grandson called me." Margaret picked up her pen. Margaret referred me to a forensic document examiner named Paul Ketterman, who worked out of a small office in Dublin, Ohio, and who had testified as an expert witness in 11 state court cases involving questioned signatures. He had close-cropped grey hair and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the manner of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by what people did to each other on paper. I brought him 3 documents. The second mortgage instrument from 2006, the lien release from 2010, a notarized power of attorney from the same month as the lien release, which I had found on the last page of the recorder's packet, and which had made my stomach go quiet and cold in a way that was different from anger. It was more like the feeling of recognizing something you have been trying not to see. The power of attorney authorized Carol Hale to act on behalf of Raymond Hale in all matters related to the property at Dunmore Street. I had never granted her that authorization. I also brought Paul a collection of authentic signature samples appraisal reports, tax returns, loan documents from properties I had worked on personally. Every signature in my own hand, spanning a period of 15 years. I had them organized in a folder with dates marked in pencil. Paul looked through them for a long time without speaking, then held the mortgage instrument and the lien release side by side under a magnifying glass. "The capital R," he said. "Yes," I said. "Your authentic signature has a specific hook at the terminal of the capital R, consistent across all these sample different papers, different pens, different years. The hook curves left, and the terminal drops below the baseline." He set the magnifying glass down and looked at me over his reading glasses. "The signature on the mortgage instrument and the signature on the lien release. The hook curves right, and the terminal stays on the baseline, consistently, on both documents." "What does that tell you?" "It tells me that whoever signed these was copying a version of your signature they had seen, probably a photocopy or scan, and they got most of it right. The letterforms are close, the slant is close, the size is close." He tapped the magnifying glass against his palm. "But handwriting habits are motor memory. The hook direction is automatic. You don't think about it. Whoever forged these had to think about it. And when you think about it, you get it slightly wrong. Can you put that in writing? I can prepare a formal report with comparative analysis and my opinion to a reasonable degree of professional certainty." He set the two documents down and aligned them parallel to each other on his desk. "Raymond, I don't know what you're planning to do with this, but I want to be clear about what I'm putting my name on. My report will say these signatures are, in my professional opinion, not authentic. I cannot tell you who forged them. I can only tell you it was not you. That's all I need," I said. I had not told Paul about Daniel, or about Gary Pollock, or about the shape of the triangle on my legal pad. Some things you share with your attorney, and some things you hold close until you understand the full dimensions of them. Paul was a technician, not a strategist. His job was to look at ink on paper and tell me what he saw. The strategy was mine. On the drive back from Dublin, I called Daniel. He picked up after 2 rings, which told me he had been expecting the call. "Can you meet me?" I asked. A pause, like, "In person." "Yes. Is that something you can do without your father finding out?" I heard him working through the particular deliberateness of a teenager who understands that some situations require adult care. "I can say I'm studying with a friend," he said. "I do that sometimes anyway." "I don't want you to lie to your father," I said, "but I need a few more days before we bring him into this. Can you tell him you have plans with a friend, without saying it's me?" "That's technically true," Daniel said. "You are technically a friend." Something moved in my chest that I will not try to name. We met at a coffee shop in Grandview. One I chose because it was far enough from Worthington where Derek lived. According to the school project research Daniel had shared with me that running into someone was unlikely. Daniel was tall and arrived 5 minutes early and shook my hand with both of his in the way that someone does when they have rehearsed the moment and are glad to have gotten through it. He had Derek's jawline. He had, I realized as we sat down, the same habit I had of centering things on flat surfaces, straightened his coffee cup on the table without thinking about it, the way I'd been straightening things since I was 23. I found something else, he said. Before I could speak, he pushed his phone across the table. On the screen was a screenshot from what looked like a property listing site, showing a commercial property in Powell, Ohio, a retail strip listed under an LLC called Meridian Bridge Properties. I recognized the name from the Dunmore Street records, he said. So I looked it up. That company owns 5 properties in Franklin County, all acquired between 2009 and 2013. I looked at the screen for a moment. Then I looked at my grandson, who was 17, and had just done in 3 days what had not occurred to anyone to do for 14 years. Your grandfather's name is listed as a lien holder on 4 of those 5 properties, he said, through what looks like a chain of title that goes back to Dunmore Street. I set the phone down. Daniel, I said, I want to tell you what I've found. I told him everything: the second mortgage, the forged signatures, Paul Ketterman's preliminary findings, Gary Pollock's name on the Meridian Bridge registration. I watched his face as I talked. He did not interrupt. He absorbed information the way a person does when they have been thinking about a problem for a while already, and what they're hearing confirms a shape they had begun to suspect. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. My dad doesn't know any of this, he said. It was not a question. I don't believe he does, I said. Daniel wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He talks about you sometimes. Not a lot, but sometimes. He looked at the table, not at me. He says he thinks you made the best decision you could with what you had. He says he wishes it had gone differently. He paused. He never sounds mad when he says it. He sounds sad. I did not answer for a moment. The coffee shop had a window looking out onto Fifth Avenue, and the March afternoon was doing its uncertain thing with the light sometimes gray, sometimes a thin gold that made the wet pavement look almost warm. Have you looked at this company's current legal status? I asked. Daniel nodded. That's the other thing. He took the phone back and navigated to a different screenshot. There's a civil suit filed against the current owner of the Dunmore Street property, the buyer who purchased it from Meridian Bridge in 2014. They're suing to quiet title because of the lien that was never properly released. The case has been pending for 2 years. A pending civil case. A buyer who had purchased the house 4 years after Gary's company sold it, and who had discovered, somewhere in the due diligence, that the title was not clean, because my name was still on the record, because the release that had been filed was forged, and I suspected and would confirm had been filed by someone who didn't know that a forensic examiner, 14 years later, would be able to tell the difference. The current owner of the Dunmore Street house was in court trying to clear a title that could not be cleared without my cooperation, and they did not know I existed. Don't say anything to your father yet, I said. Not this week. Okay, Daniel said. Next week, I said. I'll be ready by then. Margaret's office had a window that looked out onto Broad Street, and on the morning we sat down to build the full picture. She had a yellow legal pad, 2 pens, and an expression that I had learned. Over 20 years of professional acquaintance meant she was doing the math. She had pulled the civil, case it was a matter of public record, filed in Franklin County Common Pleas. The plaintiff was a man named Thomas Garfield, who had purchased the Dunmore Street property in 2014 from Meridian Bridge Properties for $340,000, which was by then close to market rate. Garfield was now trying to sell the house, and his buyer's title insurance company had flagged the unreleased lien as an encumbrance. Garfield had attempted to contact the lien holder Raymond Hale through the address on file at the recorder's office. The address was my old apartment on Fifth Avenue, which I had vacated in 2015. The certified letters had gone unclaimed. Garfield had filed a quiet title action to have the court declare the lien extinguished for abandonment. His attorney was named Patricia Vane. I had appeared before Patricia Vane twice in my career, on opposing sides of title disputes. and I had found her to be thorough, patient, and difficult to rattle. "Here's where we are," Margaret said, clicking her pen. "You have a lien on the property that is legally valid and has never been properly released. The release instrument filed in 2010 is forged, that's Paul Ketterman's opinion, and based on what you've described, I believe it will hold up, which means the release has no legal effect. Your lien is still attached." "What does that mean for Garfield?" I asked. "It means he cannot sell the house until the lien is resolved. Either you release it properly, with your authentic signature, the court extinguishes it, which they can do. But it takes time, and his title company is not going to wait around. His deal will probably fall apart." She paused. "And it means you have something that Garfield's attorney needs." "My cooperation," I said. "Your signature." She tapped her pen on the legal pad. "Raymond, you are in an unusual position. You have a valid legal interest in a property you haven't lived in for 14 years. That interest has monetary value or not, because you're owed anything from the original lien, which was resolved between you and the contractor, but because Garfield needs you to release it in order to complete his sale. People negotiate around things like this. I was not interested in negotiating with Thomas Garfield, who was an innocent party who had bought a house in good faith and had the misfortune of a forged document in his chain of title. What I was interested in was what the forged documents meant for the people who had forged them." "What's the exposure for Carol?" I asked. Margaret set her pen down and looked at me. "Forgery is a felony in Ohio," she said. "Forgery of a financial instrument, the mortgage potentially implicates federal bank fraud statutes, because a federally regulated institution was involved in the original loan. If she signed documents in your name to obtain $200,000 in financing, and if that financing was part of a scheme to transfer property below market value to a related party, you're looking at a pattern that federal prosecutors have charged in similar cases." She paused. "The challenge is 14 years. Evidence degrades. Witnesses' memories are unreliable. The statute of limitations question is complex. But discovery is recent," I said. "I found out 11 days ago. That's one argument. A federal prosecutor would make the call about whether to pursue it, and I cannot tell you how they'd see it." She picked up her pen again. "What I can tell you is this. The civil case gives you a vehicle. You can file a response to Garfield's quiet title action. You can enter your appearance as the lien holder, and when you do, you will have the ability to present evidence of the forged release, which puts the record straight about what Carol filed in 2010. Whether that triggers a criminal referral depends on a lot of things outside my control." "And Gary?" I asked. "Gary Pollock's company was the purchaser. If he participated in the scheme and the money trail you've described suggests he did, his exposure is different. He's a principal in a transaction that was structured around fraudulent instruments. That's conspiracy. Potentially." I had been thinking about Gary Pollock since the night I found his name on the Secretary of State's database. Specifically, I had been thinking about the Christmas dinners and the refilled wine glass, and the way he had always smiled at me as though he was keeping a score I couldn't see. I had spent 11 years at the same holiday tables with a man who, I now believed, had been part of a plan to take my house, and I had let it go because conflict cost more than it was worth. The thing about a man who treats every interaction as a negotiation is that he cannot understand people who are not keeping score. He reads patience as weakness. He reads silence as concession. He had spent 11 years watching me absorb things and not react, and I think he had concluded that I was someone who could be absorbed indefinitely. He was about to learn the difference between a man who is patient and a man who is waiting. I spent the following week working through the documentation with Margaret, building the record from the ground up the way I had built appraisal reports for 20 years, methodically, chronologically, with every assertion sourced to a specific document or instrument number. The second mortgage instrument, 2006 to 0034812. Notary stamp, from a notary whose license I confirmed had lapsed in 2008, 2 years before she apparently notarized the lien release on my behalf. That was a detail I had almost missed. Notary stamps include a commission expiration date, and the notary's stamp on the 2010 lien release was dated a year after her commission expired. An expired notary, a forged signature, a related party purchaser, a sale price $52,000 below market, and a company that had gone on to acquire 4 more properties in Franklin County using the same business address and the same registered agent. I pulled the instrument records on all 4. 2 of them showed Carol Hale as a signatory on behalf of the sellers. One of those sellers I cross-referenced the parcel history had been an elderly woman named Dorothy Crane, who had died in 2012, and whose estate had apparently been administered by a trust that named Carol Hale as successor trustee. Carol had not been close to Dorothy Crane when I was married to her. She had mentioned the woman twice, in passing, as a neighbor of her parents. Somehow, between our divorce and Dorothy Crane's death, Carol had become trustee of her estate, and Dorothy Crane's property had sold to Meridian Bridge Properties for $112,000 less than the assessed value. I sat with this for a long time. What had started as a story about my house, my marriage, my son, had opened into something larger and colder. I was looking at a pattern. A woman who understood how property transactions worked. She had watched me do this work for 11 years, who had used that knowledge to structure a series of acquisitions that funneled discounted properties to her brother's company, and who had, in at least one case, positioned herself as fiduciary for a vulnerable person in order to do it. I thought about Dorothy Crane. I thought about whether there were other Dorothy Cranes. I called Daniel that evening. "I need to ask you something," I said. "When your grandmother talks about money, about investments, property, anything like that, does she seem comfortable?" A pause, while he considered. "She has a nice house in Gahanna," he said. "Like, really nice. New car. She travels a lot." He paused. "Dad pays her some money every month. I know because he and Mom argued about it once. He said it was what kids did for their parents, and Mom said it was too much. Has she ever mentioned a woman named Dorothy Crane?" "Not to me," he said. "Why?" "Just following something," I said. "Don't worry about it." After we hung up, I added Dorothy Crane's name to the legal pad. Then I called Margaret and told her I thought the scope of what she was looking at might be larger than one property. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Raymond, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." "Go ahead. What do you want out of this? Because what you want determines how we proceed from here." I looked at the legal pad. I looked at the 3 questions I had written on the night Daniel called, and the additional pages of notes that had accumulated around them. What did I want? I wanted, if I am being precise, 2 things that seemed like they should go together but didn't. Exactly. I wanted the truth to exist in a form that Derek could see. I wanted my son to know that I had not abandoned him, not willingly, not the way he'd been told. I wanted the version of me that Carol had given him, the version that dragged things down and had to be cleared away. I wanted that version to have a document attached to it that said this is not accurate. The second thing I wanted was harder to say. I wanted Dorothy Crane's estate to have been handled properly. I wanted to know that what had been done to me had not been done to someone more vulnerable. Someone who hadn't had a 17-year-old grandson with a school project and a good search engine. I want the record to be correct. I told Margaret. She was quiet again for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Then here's how we do this." We filed a notice of appearance in Garfield's quiet title case on a Thursday. Margaret's name on the filing. My name as the line holder. a brief statement that the instrument recorded as a release of the lien in 2010 was forged, and that the lien holder intended to respond to the court's inquiry. We did not. At that point, elaborate. We planted the flag and waited. The response came faster than I expected. Patricia Vane, Garfield's attorney, called Margaret the next morning. She was not ruffled, Patricia Vane was never ruffled, but there was a particular precision in her voice that I recognized when Margaret played me the voicemail. The precision of a lawyer who has just understood that a case she thought was routine is not. We would like to schedule a meeting with your client, Patricia said in the voicemail, at his earliest convenience, to discuss the nature of the claimed defect in the release instrument and what Mr. Hale's intentions are with respect to the property. I had a meeting scheduled for Tuesday of the following week. Before I went, there were two things I needed to do. The first was to call Paul Ketterman and confirm that his written report was ready. It was. The second was to call Derek. I had not spoken to my son in 14 years. 11 days of preparing for this phone call had not made it easier to dial the number Daniel had given me. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the title company where I do my consultation work, on a cold morning in early April, and I held the phone and did not dial for almost 10 minutes. The parking lot had a magnolia tree near the entrance. It was just starting to bloom. That particular, uncertain pink that April magnolias have in Ohio. Too early, and almost always caught by a late frost. I had planted a magnolia in the backyard of the Dunmore Street house the year Derek was born. I wondered if it was still there. I dialed. It rang 4 times. I was rehearsing a voicemail when he picked up. Hello, his voice was the same and different at the same time. The way voices always are, over decades lower than I remembered. A little rougher, but the cadence identical to the boys. Derek, I said, it's your father. The silence that followed was not the silence of hostility. I know that silence. I've been on the receiving end of it. This was a different kind of silence. The kind that comes when you have been carrying a version of someone for a long time and the person themselves has just arrived. Dad, he said. One word, nothing attached to it. Just that. I need to tell you some things, I said, and I need you to listen before you say anything. Can you do that? Another pause. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I can do that. I told him about Daniel's call. I told him about the documents. I told him about Paul Ketterman and the capital R and the way the hook curved wrong. I kept my voice steady. I had made the decision, sometime in the previous week, that I would not give him the version of this that was about my feelings. I would give him the version that was about facts, documents, instrument numbers, dates, names. Facts could be checked. Facts could be held at arm's length and evaluated without the person doing the evaluating having to decide, first, whether they trusted you. When I finished, Derek was quiet for a long time. She told me you signed everything, he said finally. She showed me a document. I know, I said. She showed you what she'd made. A long pause. I gave you $500, he said. She gave me the envelope and she said, he stopped. She said, that's what you asked for. So it had been 500, not 100. Memory simplifies, compresses, rounds to the nearest insult. $500 in an envelope as the price of leaving. It wasn't what I asked for, I said. Another silence. Dad, Derek said. His voice had changed in the way voices change when something that has been held tightly for a long time is being slowly released. I need you to know that I've thought about this. About that day. I've thought about it a lot. I know, I said. I should have asked more questions. You were 22, I said. You believed your mother. That's not a failure. He didn't answer that. I could hear him breathing. Outside, the magnolia was pink and uncertain and beautiful. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I have a meeting on Tuesday," I said. "I'd like you to be there." The meeting was at Patricia Vane's office on High Street, on the 11th floor of a building that had been a bank in a previous life, and still had that feeling of permanent ceilings and good light. Margaret and I arrived first. We sat across a long conference table from Patricia and a young associate whose name I didn't catch, and we waited. Derek arrived 7 minutes late, which I would later learn was because he had driven past the building twice, trying to decide whether to park. He came in wearing a dark coat, his hair shorter than I'd imagined it, and he shook my hand with a formality that told me he didn't know what else to do with his hands. He looked like me in the jaw and around the eyes, and like his mother in the set of his shoulders, and I had the clear, specific sensation of not knowing what to do with my face. Daniel arrived right behind him, which Derek had not been prepared for. I watched Derek turn and look at his some rapid negotiation happening behind his eyes that resolved itself into, "I will ask questions later." We sat. Margaret introduced me to Patricia and explained briefly the nature of our position. Patricia, to her credit, did not look surprised, because Patricia was a person who had trained herself not to show that. "Mr. Harley," Patricia said, addressing me, "you are the recorded lien holder of the Dunmore Street parcel, and you are contesting the validity of the release instrument filed in 2010. "Yes," I said. "On what basis?" I nodded to Margaret, who opened the folder on the table in front of her and slid a copy of Paul Ketterman's report to Patricia's side. "The signature on the 2010 release instrument is forged," Margaret said. "We have a forensic examination report from a qualified expert with 11 court appearances in Ohio courts. The report concludes, to a reasonable degree of professional certainty, that the signature is not Mr. Hale's authentic signature." Patricia read through the first page of the report. Her associate leaned in to read over her shoulder. "We also have reason to believe," Margaret continued, "that a second instrumenta, power of attorney, recorded in 2010, authorizing a third party to act on Mr. Hale's behalf, was forged on the same occasion by the same individual, and with the same defect in the signature." I watched Derek across the table. He was reading the copy of Paul's report that I had put in front of him before we sat down. His eyes moved steadily through the text. His face was still. Patricia set the report down and looked at me. "Mr. Harley, in your assessment, who forged these documents?" "My former wife," I said. "Carol Hale." The room was very quiet for a moment. The high-rise heating system made a sounder distant hum in the building's bones. Derek did not look up from the report. "She told you I signed everything," I said. I was addressing Derek now. Not Patricia, not Margaret. Derek, who was looking at the comparative signature analysis with Paul Ketterman's arrows pointing to the hooks on the capital R. "She showed you a document, and she told you I agreed, and she told Daniel," I nodded toward my grandson, "that I wanted a fresh start without dragging the family down." Derek looked up. "She used that phrase," his voice was flat. "That's what Daniel told me, she told you." Derek turned to Daniel. Daniel met his father's eyes and nodded. To once, something changed in Derek's face. Not an explosion, there was no explosion. It was more like watching a wall that has been slowly undermined, finally acknowledge that it cannot hold its shape. His jaw tightened. He set Paul Ketterman's report down very carefully on the table, aligning it with the edge. "She showed me paperwork," he said. "She sat down with me at the kitchen table. She had a folder. She showed me what she said was your signature. On the power of attorney," I said. "That's what she would have shown you. That's the document that authorized her to sign my name on the lien release. And it's forged. According to Paul Ketterman, Yes, his methodology and conclusions are in that report. Derek sat back in his chair. He put one hand flat on the table and looked at it. "Dad," he said, "I gave you $500. In an envelope. She said you wanted a clean break and that the money was—" He stopped. He looked at me. "She said it was what you asked for." "It wasn't what I asked for," I said. "I asked for nothing. She gave you the envelope and told you to give it to me. And you did. Because you were 22 years old and you trusted your mother." A silence stretched between us, not an uncomfortable one. "Exactly, but full. The way a room is full after something large has been moved into it." Then Derek did something I had not anticipated. He looked at Daniel. "You found all of this from a school project," Derek said. "Yes, sir," Daniel said. "How long have you known?" "About 3 weeks." Daniel said, "Grandpa asked me not to say anything until he had the documents ready." Derek processed this. Then he looked at me. "You called me on a Monday," he said. "You had this whole thing ready, and you called me on a Monday. I wanted to have everything in order before I said anything to you. I didn't want to come to you with a theory. I wanted to come to you with a record." Derek looked at me for a long moment. I could not read his expression cleanly. There were too many things in it, moving too quickly. "Was that the appraiser talking?" he said. "Or the father?" "I considered that. I'm not sure there's a difference anymore," I said. Something shifted in Derek's face. Something small and careful, like a door opening a crack. Patricia Vane cleared her throat. She had been watching this exchange with the quiet patience of a person who understands that some things in a conference room are not about the conference room. "Mr. Harley," she said, addressing me, "assuming the facts are as represented and I'm going to need time to review the document to show. What is your position with respect to the lien and my client's quiet title action?" "My client intends to release the lien," Margaret said, properly, with his authentic signature. "Once the matter of the forged instruments is a matter of record. Mr. Hale is not interested in harming Mr. Garfield, who is an innocent party." "That's very cooperative," Patricia said, with the neutrality of someone who has learned to make the word cooperative carry many meanings. "My client will need certain things in exchange," Margaret said. "Written acknowledgement from Mr. Garfield and his title company that the release instrument recorded in 2010 was a forgery, that the lien was never validly released, that the proper chain of title will reflect the circumstances. Mr. Hale needs the record to be accurate." Patricia nodded slowly, and Margaret added, "We will be referring the matter of the forged instruments to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office. That is not a negotiating position. It is what will happen regardless of how we resolve the title issue." Another silence. Derek looked at his son. Daniel was watching his grandfather with an expression I would find myself thinking about for months afterward. Not exactly awe, but something adjacent to it. The particular quality of recognition that comes when you understand, for the first time, what kind of person someone is. "Grandpa," Daniel said. "Yes." "What happens to Grandma Carol?" I looked at my grandson. I thought about how to answer in a way that was honest without being cruel, in a way that acknowledged what was coming without pretending I was glad about it. "She'll have to answer for what she did," I said. "To the law. That's not in my hands. What I can do is make sure the record is correct, and that's what I'm doing." Daniel nodded. He had the look of someone processing something that had been abstract and was now specific, the particular weight of a consequence landing. Derek had said nothing for several minutes. He was looking at the table. Then he looked up, directly at me, and he said quietly, in a voice that had nothing in it except the words themselves. I should have asked more questions 14 years ago. "You were 22, I said. "You believed your mother. That's not a failure." He held my gaze. "You said that on the phone too," he said. "Because I mean it both times." The heating hum again. Outside the window, High Street ran its ordinary Tuesday business cars. Pedestrians. The grey light of an Ohio spring afternoon. Patricia Vane made a note on her legal pad. Margaret clicked her pen. Daniel straightened his coffee cup on the table without seeming to notice he was doing it. The same way I straighten things. The same habit passed down through whatever invisible current runs between a grandfather and a grandson who had not met until 3 weeks ago. That detail, the cup straightening, was the thing that nearly undid me. Sitting there in a conference room with my son and my grandson and 14 years of unresolved paper. But I am 61 years old, and I have been delivering difficult news long enough to know that the moment to fall apart is not the meeting. I kept my face even. I kept my voice level. What I did, under the table, was press my thumb into my palm and breathe. That was enough. Carol hired a defense attorney. I know this because Margaret's office received a letter from him in the second week after we filed with the prosecutor's office a letter requesting documentation, scoped narrowly, written in the measured language of someone who understood that what they were managing was serious. The Franklin County prosecutor opened a preliminary inquiry. Federal involvement was, at that point, an open question. I am not going to tell you that what followed was swift or simple, because it was neither. Legal processes in Ohio move at the speed of institutions, which is to say, steadily and without urgency, like a river that knows it will arrive at its destination, whether or not anyone is watching. What I will tell you is that 3 things happened in the months after that conference room. The first was that Thomas Garfield signed a written acknowledgement, prepared by Patricia Vane and agreed to by Margaret, that the 2010 lien release was a forged instrument and had no legal effect. I signed the proper release one morning in Margaret's Office Me authentic signature, the capital R, with the hook curving left, the terminal dropping below the baseline, and watched Margaret notarize it with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been doing this work long enough to appreciate the rarity of a transaction that goes exactly as it should. Garfield's sale proceeded. The chain of title on Dunmore Street now contained, permanently, a recorded finding that an instrument in that chain was forged. That finding would not go away. It was there, in the county record, for anyone who looked. The second thing that happened was about Dorothy Crane. The prosecutor's inquiry, once opened, expanded in the direction Margaret had anticipated. A forensic accountant was brought in to review the Meridian Bridge transactions. Dorothy Crane's estate became part of that review. I have no information about what will ultimately come of it. The inquiry is ongoing and I am not a party to it. But I know, from the investigator who interviewed me in late April, that Dorothy Crane's estate had a net value approximately $200,000 lower than her documented assets at time of death would have predicted. I do not know what happened to that money. I know that a fiduciary acted in her name and that the properties transferred through her estate went to a company owned by that fiduciary's brother. I think about Dorothy Crane sometimes. I never met her. I know her only as a name on a chain of title and a number on a forensic accountant's spreadsheet. I hope someone who loved her is paying attention. The third thing was Derek. What happened between me and my son in the months after the conference room was not a reconciliation in the sense that word usually implies, not a formal moment of healing, not a cleared table and a long conversation where everything was said and finished. What happened was slower and stranger and, I think, more honest than that. We had coffee twice in April. We talked about his work. He manages logistics for a distribution company. Good at it. Detail-oriented in the way I always knew he would be if he found the right work for it. We talked about Daniel and about Mia, who I met for the first time on a Sunday in May at a park near their house in Worthington. Mia was 14 and had her mother's height and Derek's way of being still in a crowd, that quality of not needing to fill space, of being comfortable in her own radius. She shook my hand very seriously and immediately began explaining to me the plot of the book she was reading, in more detail than I needed, and exactly the right amount. The book was about a girl who discovers her family has a secret history of navigation old maps, ocean routes, a great-grandmother who had crossed 3 seas under a name that wasn't hers. I listened to the whole summary. We were sitting on a bench near the park entrance, and at some point she stopped mid-sentence and looked at me. "Daniel says you find things in paperwork that other people miss," she said. "Sometimes," I said. "He says that's how you found out about Grandma Carol." "Your brother helped," I said. "He found the first piece. I found the rest." She considered this. "That seems like a good team," she said, and went back to telling me about the book. I thought about that for a long time afterward. A good team. I had spent 14 years operating, alone, eating alone, thinking alone, carrying the shape of what I'd lost alone, and in the space of about 6 weeks. I had acquired a grandson who straightened things on flat surfaces, a granddaughter who summarized books at length and with authority, and a son who was learning, slowly and at great cost, that the story he'd been given about his father was wrong. That is not nothing. We did not talk directly about Carol for a long time. When we finally did one evening in early June, sitting on Derek's back porch, with the last of a spring sunset, going orange behind the tree, line, he said, "I don't know how to talk about her yet." "You don't have to," I said. "She's still my mother." He paused. "That doesn't change what she did." "I know," I said. "I'm angry." He said it the way someone admits a thing they've been examining from multiple angles. "I'm angry at her, and I'm angry at myself, and I'm angry that it took my kid doing a school project to—" He stopped. He looked at the orange light in the trees. 14 years, he said. 14 years, I agreed. "Were you angry the whole time?" I thought about this honestly. "Not the whole time," I said. "For the first 2 or 3 years, yes. After that it was more like grief with the anger settled into it, like sediment." He was quiet for a while. His backyard was tiddy a vegetable garden in raised beds along the fence, a fire pit that looked like it had been used recently. He kept things in order the way I kept things in order, and I noticed it without mentioning it, because some things you observe and hold and don't say aloud. "I should have called you," he said. "You thought I'd agreed to everything. Why would you call someone who'd agreed to leave?" "Because," he looked at me, "because you were my father." I did not have an answer for that was better than silence, so I was silent. He poured more iced tea into my glass from a pitcher on the table between us. We sat there for a while in the particular companionship of 2 people who understand that there are things to say and that saying, to them now, in one sitting, would make them smaller than they are. Some conversations need to happen across months, across ordinary afternoons, across many poured glasses of iced tea. "Mia liked you," he said after a while. "I liked her. She doesn't like most people right away. She takes a long time to warm up. She told me about her book for 45 minutes. I said. Derek looked at me. Something small and complicated moved through his face. "Yeah," he said. "That's her version of liking you." And then something happened that I had not planned for and could not have manufactured. He laughed. A real laugh brief. Surprised. The laugh of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and just found, for a moment, that he could set it down. I laughed too. Not because it was funny. Exactly. Because it was true. Because truth, when it finally arrives, sometimes arrives as something that sounds like relief. The magnolia is still there. I asked Derek, and he confirmed it's still in the backyard, large enough now that it probably shades the whole east side of the house in summer. I planted it the spring Derek was born. A bare root sapling that looked, in the ground, like it would never amount to anything. I remember being unreasonably worried about it that first winter. Checking on it more than made sense. I did not go back to Dunmore Street. I may, at some point. Thomas Garfield seems like a reasonable man, based on the one letter he sent through Margaret expressing something like gratitude. But I am not ready yet to stand in front of that house as a visitor in a way that I was not ready to stand in front of it as a trespasser. There is a distinction in there somewhere that I have not finished working out. Here is what I understand now that I did not understand 14 years ago. Or rather, here is what I knew but had not let myself articulate, which is a different thing. I kept the lien on that property. I knew about it. I could have released it any time. In 14 years it was a minor thing. A few $1,000s. The contractor had been paid. There was no practical reason to keep it, and yet I did not release it. I carried it through 3 apartments, through the early anger and the later grief with sediment, through 11 years of not going back and not calling and not asking the question that Daniel asked 3 weeks into a school project. I kept it because some part of me was not finished. I kept it because some part of me knew that the story I had been given, that my son had chosen, that I had been cleared away, that my name was gone from everything, was not the complete story. I did not know what was missing. I did not know to look for forged signatures or shell companies or an expired notary's stamp. I only knew that something in the record was not right, in the way that something in a property chain is not right, even before you find the specific instrument that proves it. I am a man who reads documents. I am a man who looks for the gap between what the paper says and what is actually true. I have been doing that work for 40 years, and I am not always fast, and I am not always right. And there is one case in my professional life where I should have looked at my own record with half the attention I gave to strangers, and I did not. I trusted the structure of my life without checking it. That was my failure, and I have accepted it. But the lien, I kept the lien. And when a 17-year-old boy with a school project and a good search engine went looking for his grandfather's name, the lien was there, prescient, accurate, waiting for someone to notice it was still holding on. What I want you to take from this story, and I am not a man who usually tells people what to take from things, so I will make this the one time, is not that justice is inevitable, because it is not. It is that the record matters. What you sign and what you don't sign matters. What remains in the county database, unreleased, for 14 years, matters. The truth does not disappear because no one is looking at it. It just waits. Thank you for staying with this until the end. I know it was a long one, and I know some of you are sitting with complicated feelings about families, about betrayal, about the difference between the story you were given and the story that was true. If this brought something up for you, leave me a comment. I read every one. Tell me, have you ever discovered that a story you believed for years was built on something false? Have you ever had to choose between protecting someone you love and telling them the truth? I'm curious where you're from. Do drop your city in the comments. And if you're new here, and this is the first story of mine you've listened to, consider subscribing. There are more of these. They are all true. Some of them take 14 years to finish.